Mr. Minister, let's start with you and take us to Malaysia. You've been in the job 2.5 years. To come in as a minister right at the beginning of COVID is tricky. And I wonder if you can, as your experience as finance minister, where do you see the greatest need to build strategic foresight in the daily demands for policymaking? Wherever you can, with all of you, use anecdotes, details. You're coming here at 1 p.m. It's the lunch hour, so we want to give you something to chew on. Mr. Minister, let me turn to you first.
Thank you, Frederick. I think the word tricky is an understatement.
Yeah.
Anyway, from the perspective of a policymaker, while we look at the long-term view, the objectives are obviously important, but we need to keep in mind that the emerging economies are affected more significantly in terms of the economic impact as well as the societal impact. Right? The global economy prospects when we first got out of COVID looks very strong, looks very positive. But of course today, this is no ordinary recovery. We have seen recovery is uneven, is inequitable. We've seen that really depends on the government's capacity. Depends on the capability of governments in managing its finance and support economy. So we have seen a divergence in growth. We also see that, as I mentioned, the recovery is uneven because some countries are perhaps more fortunate in others in terms of their resources. Right? It's expected as well that some countries will recover from the pre-pandemic much quicker than others. Some are 3 years, 5 years, some even 10 years. As a result, it is critical that the developed economies assist in building capacity, right, and so that they can resume the economic and social progress. Therefore, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries and governments were actually forced to focus on short-termism, and at times this comes with the need to sacrifice future developmental as well as structural reforms. That's what we've seen in some of the developing countries in Asia. While many people, as you know, lost their job and are still at risk of losing their jobs, and businesses closed down during the lockdowns, during the peak of the pandemic, governments actually at that time, during that 2 years, needed to be very responsive. Policymakers need to be very responsive in the short term to keep the economy going, because or else it'll be a free fall. And we've seen that record amounts of fiscal stimulus. Most governments have very aggressive fiscal expansion policy if they can afford it, and it is really to support the economy. But it is only natural for us to act in that way in the short term, right? Pump prime the economy, because you look at the human brain is hardwired to fear and acknowledge the immediate threats. More recently, I think the big topic here in Davos is one of it is about inflation, the inflationary pressures, not just inflation facing the countries, but also food inflation, the increasing prices in food, this due to disrupted supply chain, etc., etc. I think we know what it is about. And issues such as employment, decent standard of living, and even simple things like having enough to survive the day are frequently, actually, if you look at it, is political in nature, right? So many political issues require governments attempting to balance the interests of the people today, people alive today, as well as balance it against those who will live in the future, right? So politicians, who are policymakers as well, mainly, on the other hand, are frequently accused of focusing too much on the short term at the expense of the long term, and in order to appease their electorates as well as to win votes, right? So they are under pressure to act quickly. Many policymakers, many democratic countries are under pressure to act very quickly, and also to deliver tangible benefits in the term of the office to be re-elected. There is less return from addressing slow burn issues, where the benefits actually you accrue later. At the same time, or investing in prevention rather than maintaining current services. So as a result, the question to me, anyway, as a policymaker, of how long-term policymakers and political leaders should look arises, and this brings about uncertainties in terms of policy continuity. So even when the government changes, we've seen that in many governments, policies tend to change as well, right? Therefore, one of the more serious issues that we must look at is how do we look at the time horizon? We're talking about the long view here. This is especially true when taking action in the short term incur costs. Yeah, many costs, even political costs. But there are also the issue of dealing with uncertainty of the future, right? It is really easier to act within the realms of the known than to plan for the unknown. And the impact of COVID-19 may highlight this. And it's all about leadership at the end of the day. So there will always be trade-off, but as a policymaker myself, we must try and find a solution that benefit the greatest number of people while also considering multi-stakeholder interests. Yeah? And the trade-off must be minimized in my view. So the pandemic actually has presented us with an opportunity as well, for a great reset, and we should not waste this crisis. This includes how we approach the issue on addressing short-term while keeping the long-term view. So hence, once again, for Malaysia anyway, since 2020 when I became the finance minister, we have announced various stimulus packages, but we believe that in the short-term priorities, especially in anticipation of the long-term challenges, we must be based on three principles. One is responsiveness, the other one is responsibility or responsive, responsible, and thirdly on reformist.
So, Mr. Minister, thanks for that fascinating opening statement. Quick question for a quick answer. In this period of COVID, in our own country, President George W. Bush had put in a whole infrastructure in the White House to deal with it, which was taken apart by President Donald Trump, and so it had to be rebuilt. So I would say that Bush was thinking long-term and put something in place. What have you put in place, or what decision do you think you've made in the last 2 years that is a specific decision that is really aimed at the long term rather than the short term?
Yeah. So on the long term, it's all about reform, right? So one of the things we've done is when we do implement or do announce packages, stimulus packages that are actually addressing the short term, at the same time, we must see that it has an effect in the longer term. For example, we extended the reach of social protection. This is really social protection for the vulnerable groups. And in this world, in Malaysia and also in Southeast Asia, the gig economy is very big. It's getting bigger by the day. But they don't have social protection, right? Because they don't contribute to the pension fund. They don't contribute to social security. So when the economy closed down, shuts down, they lost the jobs. And obviously, there's no impact. So there's a very, very big impact to this group of informal workers, right? So what we've done, for example, is we ensure that when we give them the benefits, the cash benefits to them, but we also put some money into the pension funds, into the social security agencies, and ensure that it is matched by the Grabs or the Ubers of this world, so they understand that this is something that they need to do in the longer term. You can't just rely on their income they would receive on a daily basis.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to conclude that there is really no silver bullet. No silver bullet for improving and embedding long-term in thinking in decision-making, be it government or companies or even think tanks. But I believe there are some key levers and enablers, particularly in making sure we can achieve and be firm with our long-term view. In brief, these include strengthening institutional voices for the future, policy commitment devices, we can use legal mandates, for example, having champion for key issues, as well encouraging creativity in all civil society, civil service, and all the relevant groups. So it has to be, we have to plan for flexibility and agility, importance of leadership, institutionalizing the future legal issues, right? And then we have to be, what's also important is consistent public communications to raise awareness and importance of the long view for our children's future. Last two is, of course, building economic resilience. And finally, when policy making, it has to be collaborative.
Thank you for that.